howl for the way the fabled land of the free has turned its back on what made it free and is pursuing phantoms that lead to decline and ruin. Shame on recent generations of Americans for their carelessness, their unconcern, and their ignorance of what the Republic was founded to be. Our guest today, author and thinker Os Guinness, wrote both of these warnings in his latest book, 0 Hour America. He believes the writing is on the wall for America and that it stands at a crossroads. Os, I read your book twice carefully. Can't wait to jump in. But first off, thanks for taking the time to come back on the show.
Sean, it's always a privilege and fun. So thank you.
Well, you're welcome. It is fun. You have always spoken and written with a prophetic voice. But this book seems stronger in its warning than earlier writings. First off, am I right? And if so, why?
Well, you are right. I wrote this book with real passion because for all the sense of crisis, and I live here in Washington, D.C., I still don't think people go to the heart of the crisis, let alone call for a leadership that addresses many of the deeper issues. I was for example, I was at a wonderful dinner on Capitol Hill a couple of months ago. Wonderful people, admirable. But I went home and I said to my wife afterwards, it was all trench warfare. They're doing this and we'll do that. We'll fight them here and we'll fight them there. The next election, this and so on. Incredibly short-term thinking. Whereas I think, St. Augustine, to understand a nation, you have to ask what it loves supremely, not its population or its GDP or anything like that, what it loves supremely. And there's no question what America loves supremely is freedom. And so you have to ask, what's the nature of American freedom? Where did it come from? And of course, where is it today? And I think it's deeply in trouble.
Well, one of the voices that you bring so uniquely is this deep historical understanding to see kind of the cultural moment that we're in. But you also have a personal background that seems to give you such insight and passion and concern for freedom. What is that background?
Well, as you know, I was born in China, but specifically in terms of this book and some of my books, I was there during the first 2 years of the Reign of Terror under Mao Zedong after the 1949 Chinese Revolution. So the Russian Revolution in 1917 and the Chinese in 1949 were the two great communist revolutions in the 20th century. And I've often told the story years later, I was 9 then, but years later when I was a graduate student at Oxford, I met Sir Isaiah Berlin. And it turned out, the great philosopher of freedom, he had been a 7-year-old in the in the Russian Revolution. And I was a 7-year-old at the beginning of the Chinese Revolution. And so we compared notes, but both of us had a vivid sense of the challenge of totalitarianism.
Oz, one of the things I'm really curious, and I've always wanted to ask you this, is why you're so concerned about the fate of America. And I ask that distinctly as a Christian, because you've written other books that are some of my favorites. Fool's Talk, for example, on evangelism and on doing apologetics well. So you had this deep concern with the kingdom of God, but also this concern with America. So I could imagine a critic saying, Oz, just focus on the kingdom of God, not politics. What would you say?
Well, some people do say that, as you quoted them. One reason, clearly, is that I heard the call of the Lord to come here. So I'm here as a direct response to calling. The only time in my life when I've heard the word of the Lord audibly. But a more general reason and why I got into it in the first place, clearly America is the lead society in the Western world, and the American way of ordered freedom is unique and owes most of all to the Bible, to Exodus, Deuteronomy, the Torah. So you have here not only the world's lead society, you have a vision of freedom which has become as close to the biblical view as you get in the modern world, and so it matters. because it is the
Hmm.
best view of freedom there is. Now, I would far more strongly argue for the gospel, the best
Sure.
news ever. But I think it would be delinquent, a squandering of historic waste to let
Hmm.
American freedom just slide away carelessly.
Right away, I can hear people think, wait a minute, you are merging your faith and the American experiment. What about Christian nationalism? We will get to some of those concerns down the road. Some of you are listening. But first, just tell us what you mean by the title, Zero Hour America, and what your thesis is.
Well, this is the Kairos moment. America's at a period, I don't know how long it is, certainly more than
Hmm.
days and weeks, when America must make the choices. I've tried to set out some of the basic ones in the first chapter and the last chapter to remind people. But some of these basic choices, they have to be made now. There's no sliding. There's no refusal to choose, muddling through, and all that sort of stuff. America is at a tipping point. Words are used, tipping point, inflection point, and so on. But there's a kairos moment, to put it in terms of the biblical view, which is that combination of opportunity and crisis. Seize it well, turns out well.
Hmm.
Don't seize it at all, or do it badly, and it'll turn out badly. That's the extraordinary moment we're in.
You say in your book, quote, this warning is not about other enemies coming. The enemies are already within the gates. So maybe a two-part question. What enemies distinctly are you talking about that you think threaten America? And what do you mean by freedom, the greatest enemies are always from within, not from without?
Well, that's two big questions, but take the first. You can look at China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and all the movements of radical Islamism, and they're all against us, no question. But on the other hand, what I've called the red wave, the rainbow wave, and the black wave, these are things that are internal to America. So, one of the big questions, will America choose to go the way of the American Revolution or the way of ideas coming down from the French Revolution? So the red wave is not only classical Marxism, it's the cultural Marxism, the woke movements you see across America. And they are incredibly powerful. I was just reading in terms of the rainbow wave a few minutes ago. The sad firing of a wonderful, godly,
Mm-hmm.
Orthodox professor at North Park University because he stood for Orthodox with a small o and a big O view of the sexual revolution. And he was fired cruelly with his wife suffering stage 4 cancer.
Mm-hmm.
It was both lacking in compassion and absolutely appalling in terms of freedom of speech and security of tenure in an evangelical institution. And it was an example of the rainbow wave, the sexual revolution, making incredible inroads into the church as well as into America.
So you said three, make sure I got this, three waves. There's the red wave, which is neo-Marxism, the rainbow wave, which is the sexual revolution, and then did you say the black wave? Is that Black Lives Matter, the organization, or what do you mean by that one?
No, Black Lives Matter and Antifa and Occupy Wall Street are all part of the red wave.
Okay.
Cultural Marxism. No, I should have made clear actually, the black wave is radical Islamism.
Okay.
And of course, that's more outside the country than in. But we've got to recognize that while their principal threat today is to Israel, they call Israel the little Satan. And the big Satan
Hmm.
is the US and the West at large. And what you see why they're so dangerous, and you can see here, they've made inroads into the Protestant liberal church. But at the heart of radical Islamism was Hitler's joining the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. And you could see that lethal combination of Nazism and Islamism joining together, leading to a vicious hatred of the Jews and of course a hatred of the Christian West too. But I should have made clear that's more outside the West at the moment than
Okay.
inside. The other two are thoroughly inside. I live in Virginia. Our wonderful new governor, Glenn Youngkin, came in partly thanks to the explosion of interest about CRT, critical race theory, in Loudoun County and the way it roiled parents. Thank God it happened. But many Christians didn't know the roots of that. It's been around 100 years.
Hmm.
But they thought it was something that went back to the Harvard Law School in the 1970s. And people don't realize how critical race theory, critical queer studies, critical women's studies, they're all united. They're not separate. And many of them go back to the same roots in Paris. The sexual revolution came from the Palais Royal, where the political revolution came from. And the end game of them all is the overthrow, not only of the US, but of Western civilization.
So the black wave, radical Islam, primarily external. The red wave, a kind of Marxism or neo-Marxism cropping up within universities, within businesses. And then the sexual revolution, those two are internal. Now, in your book, what I appreciate is you have some biting words for Trump and some biting words for Biden. You criticize the left and you criticize the right. But your primary focus, based on the two of those three you just mentioned, would be on the left. There's a lot of people who would say, no, the greatest threat in America is from the right. Why do you pick those two, and how concerned are you of threats that might be coming from the right?
Well, let me make very clear why. A great question, Sean. The right can be ugly, extreme, evil, and anti-Christian, no question. And at its worst, it's horrible. But there's a simple reason why the left is far more dangerous. And you can put it in two words: social location. In other words, they have the support of the colleges and universities, much of the press and media, significant voices even in the US Congress, take the Squad, and elements of the Justice Department, the intelligence community, and so on. In other words, the right has nothing in terms of the power in the establishment and the elite institutions of America. And that's why the left is far, far more dangerous. And President Biden is totally wrong. It's upside down from what he's saying. The left is the main danger today.
That's really helpful, that we take strong criticism to the left and the ideas of the right, but the left simply has more social location and power to cause damage than the right, hence the focus there. That makes sense where you're coming from. Now, one of the points, it was kind of a sub-point, but it jumped out to me. I wanted you to explain to us what you mean by this. Is you said the plague was a trailer for the crisis that will come if the nation persists in its present course. So how did the plague illustrate the coming potential crisis for America if we don't change course soon?
Well, there have been commentaries on the erosion of democracy and the shift to oligarchy. In other words, a growing chasm between the elites, the experts, the rulers, and ordinary people. Now, clearly you can look back to the election of 2016. Trump spoke to the forgotten people and became their champion. That's why people consider him so dangerous. But if you look at the pandemic, take, say, the elites again and again, the role of the experts. We know best. Science says. You could see how much there was a control by it and reliance on forces like science. So trust the science was trust the scientific expert who has the power. Think of Dr. Fauci and his squelching the alternative voices and so on. So you can see many of these things, the lockdowns, the control, calling opposing views disinformation, and so on. In other words, the end of the pandemic, that gap between the elites and the people had grown deeper and more of a chasm, and that's very, very dangerous.
So given your background and given your study, you look at the way the plague was largely handled, and it looks like writing on the wall to the direction you've seen places like in the French Revolution, Communist China, and other places go, and that is potentially on the doorstep of America. Is that overstating it? Is that accurate?
No, not at all. You take, say, Klaus Schwab's global reset. In other words, they took the pandemic, the idea, don't waste a good crisis. But every time you have something like that, they go for the highest level and the greatest control. So Schwab's reset is now a global reset. And you can see that that's behind a whole lot of some of the movements there are today. There's no respect for the local, the autonomous, the independent. So I've introduced what I love, George Washington's favorite biblical quotation, which is people living under their own vine and fig tree, which comes, of course, from the Old Testament. In other words, local, peaceful freedom. Now, we've got to develop something like that. In the old days, the balance had to be between the local and the national, because there wasn't a global when America was America. There were just nations. But now in the global world, nations themselves are threatened by the super global. And so the tension is between the local, the national, and the global. And we as Christians, we're not afraid of the global. We're against a one world government. H.G. Wells's World Republic, we're against that. That's the Tower of Babel in 21st century form. But we're not against globalization, because global is in the DNA of Jews and Christians. In you, Abraham's told, all the families of the earth will be blessed. And of course, we, as followers of Jesus, the Great Commission, we love the global, but we also love the local. And we've got to have a political view that doesn't just go for the global at the expense of the local. And that's what began to happen with real acceleration in the time of the pandemic.
So this is probably a good time to ask you a question I was going to ask down the road, is the distinction you make between globalism and globalization. What is that key distinction? Why does that matter?
Well, it matters a lot. Globalization is a process. It just happens. The interconnectedness of humanity reaching higher and higher levels. Now, missionaries have been a part of that in the past, conquerors with their armies, sailing ships, and of course today is the age of the digital revolution and the internet. So we have so-called 3S forces: speed, scale, and simultaneity. You can get almost anywhere in the world within 24 hours and talk to most of the world at once if you really want to. So globalization, for better or worse, has happened. It's a process. But globalism believe in the global at the expense of the local and the national, above all to profit from it economically. So you take outsource to China or Vietnam or wherever, and you produce rust belts in America. But all you're concerned about is profit. And in the widest way, they are globalists. And that's extremely dangerous, because it will lead to that global republic, cosmocracy, as H.G. Wells called it.
One of the connections that you spell in the book that really got my attention was the connection between truth and trust. And when we lose truth and trust, it spells the ruin of our republic. In fact, you said, quote, "The decay of truth and trust spells the ruin of our republic." How do you see truth decaying? Explain what you mean by that. And what's the connection with trust and the decay of the republic?
Well, someone who speaks the truth and lives the truth is trustworthy. So when you have a high truth, high trust society, you have a great deal of freedom. But when truth collapses, as you know well, it's ruled out by postmodernism. There's no such thing as truth. There is only power. Well, you don't have trust. It's what the scholars call the hermeneutics of suspicion. Everyone has an obstacle. Everyone has an agenda. So if you want to be canny, you have to approach everything anyone says certainly the government and everyone else too, with a great deal of mistrust. And as
Hmm.
Solzhenitsyn says, you get something like the Soviet Union, where mistrust was the worldview. Well, then you have no freedom, just
Hmm.
manipulation. So truth and freedom are obviously close. You think of our Lord. You will know the truth, and the truth will set
Hmm.
you free. But that goes socially too. So truth, trustworthiness, character all help freedom. High truth, high trust, high freedom. Low truth, low trust,
Hmm.
no freedom.
Also, on a real practical level, before we come back to the narrative in your book, one of the questions I get asked more now than ever is, how do I find truth? There's so many voices, there's so much fake news, I don't even know who to trust. What kind of practical things do you give people to know truth and figure out who to trust with endless voices and a world that just propagates fake news?
Well, we've got to start with, the notion of truth itself. And I'm sure you have discussed that many times on your great podcast. In other words, as C.S. Lewis often used to say, truth is about something. And what
Hmm.
truth is about is reality. So truth is words or claims that describe reality, the reality of reality. Now, in the biblical view, of course, the Lord, the center of everything, that is reality. And so his word is true. So, anyway, the point is you have a solid view that there can be truth as the reality of reality. And that's different,
Hmm.
say, Hindu view of illusion, Maya, and postmodern view of there is no truth, everything's undecidable. But the practical level comes in. How on earth do we keep ourselves from being hoodwinked? Above all, with these sources of information. Which newspaper do you read? Which channel do you watch for television? And I think the key thing here, there's no easy way. We're all liable to be
Hmm.
fooled in a day when the big lie is so powerful. We have to choose, I think, a variety so that we hear different sides, but we have to know clearly where they're coming from.
Hmm.
So, New York Times comes from a very different place than the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post, say, from The Economist. And the key thing is to have a variety and not just get stuck on one source and be prepared to look at the other side. But whatever the variety is, to know the assumptions that they're coming from so that you can discount things, you realize where they're way off and so on. But it's not easy today. The
Hmm.
other thing we all need is friends, because I may be hoodwinked as an individual, but you can help me.
Hmm.
My wife can keep me in check. My fellowship group that I meet with once a week, they can help me, and so on.
Hmm.
So we've got to have a solid view of truth, and that's in the Lord and in the scriptures. But then we've got to be very careful about the sources of information. And so we've got to think clearly the way we eat clearly. Americans
Hmm.
eat well today and not carelessly, except for the fast food stuff. And we got to do the same with the digestive information.
Hmm. It's really interesting to hear you say that. I remember in high school, my father saying to me, he goes, "Son, one of the most important things when you read an article or a book is to find out what is the worldview and presuppositions of the person who wrote it. That'll shape everything." And that just stuck with me, 30 years ago when he said it. So it's just fascinating to hear you say the same thing. That's really helpful. Now we're going to shift in a minute to some of your positive solutions moving forward, but just one more kind of diagnosis. You talk about the moral corruption and the collapse taking place today. You just addressed your concern philosophically. What do you mean by that moral corruption and collapse that's so concerning in terms of 0 hour for America?
Well, let me explain the general background to that chapter because it's actually one of the more original ones.
Mm.
And I've got a new book coming out later with even more in it. Everyone, or a lot of people, are concerned with climate change. But whether or not you agree it's happening, climate change is external to us.
Hmm.
Whereas Rabbi Sachs used to talk about cultural climate change. And that's far more deadly because it's internal to us. And above all, It's about the erosion of truth, the way we've been talking, and the erosion of ties, the things that bind us to each other. And I tell in the book, I was, every so often when I'm reading or thinking, something hits me and I just sit there in amazement
Hmm.
silently for half an hour or so. And one of
Hmm.
those times was when I read Lord James Bryce, writing about 1900. And he looks at Europe. He's the Victoria's ambassador to the US. He says Europe, even if it declines, always has tradition and always has social cohesion. People live in small villages, small towns. They know each other. They're bound together. You can't have extreme chaos. Whereas he said, America has such freedom, such mobility, nothing holds Americans together in this incredibly free society except one thing: religion. This is 1900, remember.
Hmm.
And then Bright says, my goodness, if religion were ever to glow in America, you would have, and now I'm quoting, the completest revolution of all.
Hmm.
Nothing else to hold Americans together. Well, I boil it down to those three things you mentioned: philosophical cynicism. There's no truth left,
Hmm.
nothing decidable. Moral corruption. What's right and wrong? Things are turned up on their heads, inside out, back to front today. And then the social collapse. The ties have gone, the
Hmm.
family breakdown, etc.,
Hmm.
etc. People talk about the unraveling, the erosion, the fraying of America. This is what Sachs describes as cultural climate change. So,
Hmm.
in the book I've written now, I bring in, you take, say, the school shootings, which are tragic.
Hmm.
And of course, the liberals say guns, red flag laws, gun lobbies. No, certainly there's a gun in every school shooting, but the other constant is a fatherless loner.
Hmm.
Often you have the dark web, you have misogyny, you have nihilism, and so on. And you need to look at these things to explain the horror of the mass shootings in schools and so on. America is suffering drastically
Hmm.
from a cultural climate change. Now, it's bad enough, say, Uvalde or Parklands or Columbine or whatever. But say in a generation, you have a whole army of people like that.
Hmm.
Or say you have added to it people who followed the extreme radicals of the trans movement and they've lost their breasts or lost their male parts. And they realize when they're 30 or 40, these things are irrecoverable.
Hmm.
And they've been duped and they've been betrayed and it's irrecoverable. And the anger that's going to be there then. So the
Hmm.
coming harvest of lostness, confusion, anger is only going to get more extreme. And all of this
Hmm.
is the cultural climate change that most of our secular friends don't even begin to recognize.
I appreciate that in your diagnosis, you make a philosophical diagnosis, the world of ideas, a moral diagnosis, our behavior, treatment one of another, and then a relational diagnosis, the ties are breaking down. It's all of those together holistically that's leading to this nihilism that you're discussing. Now, let's shift a little bit to your positive response to this. You say America's at a crossroads. One option is revolution that we talked about, whether that's the sexual revolution, neo Marxist revolution. The other option is oligarchy, which you discussed, or the third one is homecoming. And you talk about how a Judeo Christian worldview is the only worldview that can provide a genuine foundation for freedom. What is it about the Judeo Christian worldview that allows for this we don't see in naturalism or in Eastern religions?
Well, first on the notion of homecoming. I'd never heard that word till I moved to live in America. And
Hmm.
of course, as you know, you're going back to your alma mater in the fall for a big weekend or whatever, homecoming. But then I discovered the Hebrew word is much deeper.
Hmm.
So the Greek word for repentance, metanoia, that about turn of heart, mind, and spirit that every pastor and most lay people know. But the Hebrew word teshuvah adds something else. When you turn away from the Lord to what is false and untrue and unjust, and then repent and turn back to the Lord, it is not only an about turn, it's a homecoming, because we're coming back to Him and to the truth and to freedom and justice. And I love that idea.
Hmm.
America truly needs to come home. And I love the fact, we discussed earlier on an earlier program the difference between, say, a biblical view of justice and the
Mm-hmm.
biblical and the radical left view of justice. But when it comes to freedom, the differences are even greater. Because when you look at secularism, there isn't a leading secularist thinker who believes in freedom. They all believe in chance and necessity
Hmm.
and determinism. So Marx, Freud, B.F. Skinner, J.B. Watson, you come down to Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris, they all believe in determinism. And yet the scriptures treat us as free. Now, we can be addicted and finally addicted to sin. And you have a very realistic view in the scripture of the way sin ruins freedom. But you still have a high view of freedom. And I love that. And that's what I've tried to unpack. I've tried to put in 7 foundation stones that are biblical views of freedom, which we can rediscover and stand for and champion and argue for today. Because Jews and Christians have the highest, richest view of freedom the world's ever seen, and certainly discussed today.
Now, I want to get to a few of those 7 defining features of freedom, but first, I know in the minds of many people watching this are going, okay, wait a minute, Oz. This feels like a separation. I thought we had separation of church and state. We're talking about freedom. You're bringing these religious ideas in. Isn't this a kind of Christian nationalism? So I realize I'm giving you a lot of 2-part questions, but how concerned are you about Christian nationalism? And how does your proposal of freedom maybe compare and contrast with Christian nationalism?
Well, let's think that through, because there's a huge amount of confusion about Christian nationalism, particularly from many Christian college professors who should know better. Any idolatry is blasphemous. Only the Lord is God, nobody else. So if a nation is made into an idol, that is bad, bad, bad. But I go along with George Orwell when he said there's a difference between patriotism. We all need to belong somewhere, and people love where they come from. They love their nation. They see its faults, but they still love it. There's a proper love for patriotism and country. Although nationalism, you can see particularly in Europe in the 19th century and the 20th century, very easily becomes an idol. So if nationalism is an idol, it's wrong. The trouble is today, as we've shifted from the nation over against the local, which is the old tension, we've now with the global over against the nation and the local. So many Christian scholars and people larger, they say that any defense of your country, patriotism, is Christian nationalism. That's terrible, because they're undermining patriotism altogether. There's a proper love for one's country under God. You recognize its best, you attack its worst, but you love it and are prepared to sacrifice for it, and soldiers even to die for it in war and so on. So I think the way the label Christian national, I've been accused of being a Christian nationalist. I'm not even American. And I think the Christian college professors who throw that round, they're rather more short-sighted. They're right to attack an idolatry of nationalism. But what they're not aware of, how about the idolatry of globalism? That's the going danger, the current danger in our world.
It seems like you're hitting at one of the key concerns with Christian nationalism, making idolatry out of a particular country. One of the other concerns people say is unnecessarily fusing ideas that were meant for Israel and talking about America in the language as if it's the light, shining light on a hill that Israel once was. and replacing that with America. How does your project differ from that component of Christian nationalism?
I wouldn't call it my project.
Well, yeah,
Remember, I'm American, Sean, but I know it's just
your ideas.
Israel is not America, and America is not Israel.
Hmm.
The Hebrew covenant was a covenant with the Lord as a partner. Whereas the American Constitution, we the people, is a covenant of Americans with Americans. And for most of them at the time, and for many today, it was a Constitution covenant under God, but not with God. So there are very important differences, but there are far greater differences between Israel and America and all the other nations, for the very simple reason that the American experiment owes more to Israel than to anything else, certainly than to the Greeks and the Romans and so on. So many Americans need to realize how much through the Reformation came out of what I call the Sinai Revolution. So covenant became constitution. Consent of the governed became the consent of the governed. Separation of powers became separation of powers and checks and balances. So someone like James Madison in Federalist 51, he's getting his ideas about the danger of the abuse of power from John Witherspoon, a Presbyterian minister and theologian. And of course, the Scots, John Knox and others, they'd gone back to Exodus. Oliver Cromwell in England, who failed, let's be clear, he failed. But he said the Exodus was the direct parallel to what he was trying to do in the Civil War, in the English Revolution. In other words, our secularist friends, they pretend that where did freedom come from? Where did toleration come from? The Enlightenment. Nonsense. The 17th century, not the 16th, that was the Reformation. The 17th century was called by historians the biblical century. And the fascination in politics was the, quote, Hebrew Republic. In other words, what God has set up on Mount Sinai. Even Hobbes refers far more times to that than to any other writer in the Leviathan, although he was an atheist. And so on, Americans don't realize the profundity of the roots.
So the key is just to make sure that we're on the same page and that every viewer understands, is you're saying there's certain ideas in the American experiment that are taken from lessons that are learned and expressed in God's covenant with Israel in the Old Testament scriptures. But you're not saying that America is uniquely God's agent for this time. That's where you would draw the line and say, no, I'm not saying God selected America. I'm saying within America are built in certain principles about freedom that only come from or primarily come from Judeo-Christian roots. And we can't have America thrive with freedom and be an example to the world if we sever those roots. Is that a fair summary?
Absolutely. You put it very well. In other words, let me broaden it again. I may have said this in an earlier podcast, but if you look back to the church, it became the official religion of Rome in 380, when Theodosius declared the Roman Empire Christian. But I would say at that time, the church made a bad mistake. It copied Roman structures uncritically. Roman structures, you had a Caesar and consuls and senators and so on. It was hierarchical. And then the church had the Pope and the cardinals and the bishops, hierarchical. And it was Lord Acton, a great Catholic layman, who said, all power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. In other words, if you have hierarchical power, you're closer to Rome or to Egypt or the Tower of Babel or whatever. The Reformation said, no, that's not biblical. Hierarchical structures are not biblical. What is? Exodus is covenantal. And so not so much Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, Bullinger, John Knox, Oliver Cromwell. The Mayflower Compact is a covenant. John Winthrop, his famous model of Christian charity on the Arbella, talking about a covenant. John Adams says when he writes the first written constitution, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, what's he talking about? A covenant. The covenant idea was in New England churches, was in New England marriages, was in New England townships, and in 1787 it became the US Constitution. Now, as Americans need to realize the profundity, and the trouble is today, you probably saw a couple of professors last week, one from Harvard, one from Yale, said the Constitution is broken and should not be reclaimed. They want a popular democracy. They're cutting out the heart of the republic. And that's extremely dangerous. Now, we can't just say the Constitution is law, Supreme Court, lawyers, lawyers, lawyers. No, it's much deeper than that. And Christians should try and reinvest it with much of the original depth that comes down from the book of Exodus. No, we're not Israel. No, as I said, it is the deepest, richest view of freedom and the living together freely the world's ever seen. It would be historic squandering just to throw it away, either out of ignorance or carelessness.
Os, I think I've told you this, but you have single-handedly expanded my understanding of freedom more than anybody else in your multiple writings. So even a book I wrote for teens on sexuality, I frame it in terms of what does it mean to really be free? Freedom from and freedom for. And I owe that to you. Now, in this book, you have 7 defining features of freedom. We won't go through all of them because I don't want to steal the thunder. I hope people will pick up your book, again, 0 Hour America. But there's one connection here in particular I think would be helpful for you to draw out as you talk about the relationship between freedom and taking responsibility, not only for yourself, but in a sense that involves a respect for others. What is that relationship between freedom and taking responsibility?
Well, look in the Bible. Part of sin and evil in the scriptures from Genesis 3 on is refusal of responsibility and ducking the blame and exonerating ourselves by blaming someone else. So, Adam, the woman you gave me.
Yep.
Or Cain, am I my brother's keeper? No. And so it goes on. And you can see we're living today in the golden age of exoneration. There's always other people to blame, particularly if we can call ourselves victims of this, that, or the other. But in Scripture, freedom and responsibility go hand in hand. If we make a choice, we shoulder the consequences of the choice we've made, whether it's in our words or our actions or whatever. And that means we must not only talk about, say, rights today, we must talk about responsibilities and duties today, because the modern world and sin earlier has divided them. And that's very dangerous. Freedom has to assume responsibility. And responsibility isn't a kind of higher virtue of the supremely virtuous. And I'm free, and if I want to, I will then be responsible. No. As soon as we're free, we are responsible. As soon as I say I am an agent, a subjective agent, and whether it's I say something or I do something, I am automatically, immediately, inherently responsible for what I say and what I do.
I've sometimes been asked what I think is some of the biggest lies that this new generation, Gen Z, is tempted to believe. And I often say a lie about freedom, that freedom is doing whatever you want without restraint. That's how it's often defined for me. These 7 features, you really flip this idea of freedom upside down and talk about it's the ability to make a choice, but also live with the consequences that come from that. If we don't live with the consequences, we're not really free. So maybe at some point in the future, we'll just do an entire show going into some depth on what freedom is, because I think that's at the heart of what you're talking about, at the heart of America, at the heart of kind of this cultural conflict. But one of the issues that you bring up, and I'm so glad you talk about this, Os, is you have a huge respect for our founders. You talk about homecoming, but obviously in the back of some people's minds is, wait a minute, our framers were profoundly flawed, in particular on the issue of race. that how can you have a country built on freedom enslaves a race of people? And you challenge some of these ideas with a phrase I want to read to you from your book, and then I want you to unpack it. You said, quote, contrary to advocates of the 1619 Project, slavery and racism are not in the DNA of America's great experiment, but they are the absolute and fundamental contradiction to its DNA. Mm-hmm. What do you mean?
Well, put it this way. My family were friends and supporters of William Wilberforce. William Wilberforce, our evangelical brother, pleaded with Thomas Jefferson first and later President James Monroe to join a concert of benevolence tackling slavery. Europeans could see an ocean away the contradiction between the Declaration and slavery. So Samuel Johnson, who created the first dictionary, he said, I'm not quoting exactly, but this is the gist, how is it that those yelping about freedom, as he put it, are the drivers of Negroes? In other words, the contradiction was obvious in the beginning, but of course there were reasons. As you know, there were people in the Congress like Samuel Hopkins who fought slavery tooth and nail. But you wouldn't have had all 13 of the colonies signing on to the Constitution if they hadn't allowed some compromise with it. And so you had the dreadful 3/5 laws and so on in order not to lose the southern states. But that was a dreadful compromise with the devil. And it created all the problems that led up to the Civil War. And the tragedy was, well, Lincoln tackled it and paid with his life for it. In the Jim Crow era, they didn't press it through and see justice restored to everybody. And so it all had to happen over again with Martin Luther King. And then what was left over has now been ignited, detonated by the radical left. And, if you read Jakob Burckhardt on freedom in the 19th century, he says whenever you have injustices unaddressed, they're kind of like explosive material. Think of bombs left over from World War II. Suddenly someone stumbles on, goes off, or an enemy wants to detonate one. Whenever you have injustices unredressed, they are very dangerous to a freedom-loving country because someone, a friend or a foe, can set them off, and that's what's happened. So America's got to redress them today once and for all, or the American future will be ruined by the American past.
So at this crossroads, what would it look like to really reckon with our racist roots? How can we experience liberation from our sordid past, given that so many of this are parents, grandparents, multiple generations in the past? How would we take ownership today, right the historic wrongs, and move forward with genuine freedom?
Well, remember, as biblical people, Jews and Christians, the Bible never airbrushes sin or evil. A huge difference, say, between the Greek classics, Achilles and all these people. You see their heroism. You're not shown, like the Bible shows you about David. He's an adulterer. He's a murderer. There's Solomon with all his thousands of wives and so on. The Bible never airbrushes any of its heroes, thank God. And we should neither. So we should be unashamed to look at everything we know has happened. There's no airbrushing, no shoving it under the carpet. But then the question comes, how do you redress it? And I would say again, I've said this many times in the last 2 years, look at the way the left does. You find a victim, weaponize a victim, set up a conflict of powers that can only end in the peace of despotism. In other words, when you have a power so unrivaled, it can put down all other powers, authoritarianism. Compare that, and I'm only using words quickly, and you've got to unpack each of them, which you're well capable of, Sean, and pastors should be. Think of how the Bible does it. 1, truth addressed to power. 2, repentance and about turn and confession. 3, forgiveness, freeing the
Mm.
past, freeing the future of a second chance. And 4, reconciliation. Now, those are simple words, single words when I put it like that. Unpack them. They are dynamite in terms of addressing wrong. So to me, it's very sad that at a time when America's grappling with the unaddressed problem of racism and slavery, where's the cross?
Mm.
We have made the cross spiritual only, or private, personal only. Whereas you think Yom Kippur, the Old Testament Day of Atonement, was to solve the problem of the golden calf, a national sin. Now, certainly after that, individuals too, but it was a national sin as well as individual sin. And shame on us. The way I put it is this, Sean. In the problem of racism and slavery, America's greatest evil meets the establishment's greatest blind spot, they have no clue,
Mm.
meets the radical left's greatest fraud and disaster, they make the problem worse, meets the gospel's greatest glory.
Mm.
But we have brought them together.
Mm.
Could there be a day in the future where you have national atonement and reconciliation? Now, we know
Mm.
most of America today isn't Christian. Still, the huge majority of Americans are either Jewish or Christian.
Mm.
And then, of course, there's a huge number of people broadly sympathetic. That would be enough to have a serious day of national atonement and reconciliation, which would include, of course, a resolute determination to tackle every injustice in our own time so that we're not leaving inequities and injustices that might blow up in the face of future generations.
Just again, for clarity, you're not pushing Christian nationalism, you're not promoting a theocracy, but you do talk about repentance. So I'm curious, at this crossroads that we're at, again, revolution, oligarchy, or homecoming, is it possible for America to preserve its freedom that the nation was founded on, although flawed in practice, without a kind of spiritual revival? Do we have any examples of that in history that you're aware of?
Well, the Lord knows there are so many levels of the problem that only revival could touch.
Hmm.
I'll never forget a congressman saying to me, if there's a flood, a small boy can put his finger in the dike and be a hero. But I look out in America and what I see is a mudslide. You can't stop a mudslide with a finger. There are
Hmm.
things that only revival can touch.
Hmm.
But I mentioned Lincoln. In his 48, I think 49 months as president, he introduced something like 10 different proclamations like days of fasting and so on. That was most unusual. And he didn't enter the White House as a well-known churchgoer, let alone Christian. He came deeper and deeper in his faith under the challenge of the Civil War. But he realized certain things had to be done. He led the way. And one of the crying needs in America today, both in the church and in the nation, is leadership. Evangelicalism's in chaos without a
Hmm.
leader. When I was a boy in England, we had John Stott, Martin Lloyd-Jones. Everyone would listen to them. No one like that in America. When I first started coming here, I had Billy Graham and many others like. There's nothing like that today.
Hmm.
We need leadership. Leadership could call us back and do an immense amount. And the same is true politically. Where is the modern equivalent of Lincoln? I was
Hmm.
talking to a senator about this, and I realized, of course, at the end of the discussion, and he was describing to me the relentless viciousness every day of the attacks on him, partly because of his faith. And of course, I remembered as I left the Senate, Lincoln stood and Lincoln paid for it at the cost of his life. There will be a cost
Hmm.
for Christians who stand at whatever level we need to stand today.
Hmm.
But as you know, Sean, the wonderful thing about biblical leadership, it's not just people at the top or people out front, the CEO, the president, the general, or whatever, Biblically, leadership is someone taking responsibility, taking the initiative for whatever is right in front of them. Might be an opportunity, might be a crisis. They do it. That's leadership. So each of us is a leader at our level in our spheres, but we do need it at the highest level too.
I'm glad you brought it down to kind of the person on the street, so to speak. And my last question for you is related to what people can do. And as I put myself in people's shoes, I feel like God's allowed me to have, whether it's books or social media or this YouTube channel, a voice to be a part of the conversation. But I read your book and I still feel like there's these massive forces going on, and I can't change anything on the big picture. I can only imagine there's people watching, hearing this, feeling like, Oz, I've got no voice. There's nothing I can do. What would you say to people who feel that way in terms of where history is going and maybe feel just helpless? What are some practical things that all of us can do to make a difference?
Well, Sean, I would say we're all little people. Looked at in terms of the billions and billions in our world, let alone the 330 odd million in this country, we're all little people. But I would challenge each person, take a piece of paper and map out your life. We live at home. Our home is in a neighborhood. We go to our workplace. But then almost everybody has things that go wider than those various things. You have your podcasts. People can email. We can give to charities that touch poor people in the Philippines. In other words, you start to think about everything we do. There's a widening series of concentric circles, and our calling before the Lord is to touch each of these. They're small. If we touch each of these spheres and of life that we're in for Him as salt and light engaged, then I do it, you do it, she does it, he does it, our grandparents do it, our grandchildren do it. You start to see an awful lot of people are touched by an awful lot of people. And so we've got to see that every individual really matters. Now, let me broaden it. That, I think, is where we all begin. We are faithful in our callings. And I love the old saying of Hudson Taylor, a little thing is a little thing. But faithfulness in a little thing is a big thing. And so we've got to map out the spheres of calling. But think of this. A lot of Americans aren't even engaged. I meet people all over the country who say things like, well, I'm faithful. I just keep my head down. Things are getting dark. I am increasingly like the early church. The early church is my model. That's not the way to go. We should be faithful like the early church, but the early church were faithful in an imperial dictatorship. Politically, they had no room to move. But here we are in America, largely, but not completely, shaped by the Hebrew Republic. And in the Sinai Republic, as we read Exodus, every Jew is responsible for every Jew. The reciprocal responsibility of everyone for everyone. One for all, as the Three Musketeers put it, all for one. So every American is responsible for America. And for Americans to quit because the climate looks dark is a failure of calling and discipleship, but it's a bad failure of citizenship. Of course, citizenship's almost lost today with open borders and bad civic education and so on. But we've got to have an overarching reason for why it's worth being involved. Now, we've got to do, this is another whole discussion, the Lord's work in the Lord's way. So we're in politics, but not the way others do it. We must never be politicized. In other words, sucked into the political styles of activism that others are. No, always the Lord's work in the Lord's way. But you take the examples of the great evangelical political leaders. I mentioned Wilberforce. Or take Lord Shaftesbury in the 19th century, or Abraham Kuyper in Holland in the 20th. We have some magnificent models of how to do it Christianly. But this is an incredibly important time to do it. And as you keep preventing me from sounding, I'm not a Christian nationalist. I'm not even America. And I admire what's happened in this country at its best.
Hmm.
So resist the worst, stand well for the best, because it's the richest, deepest view of freedom and justice the world's ever seen.
Hmm.
And it'd be a shame to throw it away.
Also, I remember on a previous podcast or interview we did, I asked you what you thought your legacy might be, and I will never forget your answer. I've shared it many times. Where you said to me, you said, Sean, legacy, the idea of legacy is a secular idea. What matter is God says, well done, my good and faithful servant. Faithfulness is something we can control. And so
Yeah.
your encouragement to just look around my neighborhood, my family, take responsibility, live out that freedom is one of the most important things we can all do. And we have that responsibility. That's what we can control. We can't control where America goes at this crossroads. But what I like about your book, again, 0 Hour America, and it's a quick read, I hope my viewers will pick it up, is you're kind of like a Paul Revere going through saying, wake up, America, boldly and clearly as you do. And it's a book I would recommend as highly as any. Os, appreciate your voice, appreciate your friendship. Thanks for always coming back to join me when you have new books. And you mentioned you got another one coming out. We'll talk about that if you're willing whenever it releases as well.
That's a book for seekers coming out next March, much closer to your normal sense of calling. But it's always a joy to be with you, Sean. God bless.